G'day. In this series I'm cycling the Mawson Trail in South Australia, a 700 kilometre ride through the landscapes of my childhood. In the previous episode, my friend Dave AXFORD and I rode from Quorn to Riverton, through the state's mid-north farming districts.
Fantastic country down here, had a lot more rain. Fencing's good. Bit of green grass for the sheep and the roos. Looks like a beautiful morning for a ride.
Welcome to episode 3, South. The final leg of Through Ranges Sad and Beautiful, where we continue the journey through the famous Barossa Valley wine region and on to the city of Adelaide. As always, I'll be using my camera and journal, on the lookout for a decent photograph and a poem along the trail.
From Riverton across to the Barossa Valley today. Forecast is for southwesterlies and rain coming our way in the next day or two. So with a bit of luck, we'll get some good riding in today, and then we'll check the weather forecast and take it from there. So good cyclist breakfast, coffee and a fry-up. That's what we'll need to get through. Whatever you can find along the way. Some salami, an egg, a bit of tomato, and the all-important olive oil.
In my younger years, my adventures had been, well, more adventurous. Climbing, skiing and paddling in remote wilderness locations around the world, weeks at a time not seeing another person. Long-distance cycling touring was something new and was every bit as satisfying. Living from the bike, riding from town to town, paying attention to the landscape. I love the daily routines of the outdoors, making meals, thinking carefully about what to carry, packing, checking the maps for the next part of the journey.
Off for a coffee, X? Yep. Into Riverton.
Riverton is a small mid-north town on the Gilbert River. In its heyday, it had a large rail yard and serviced the wheat and sheep farms of the surrounding districts. We lived there when I was a young boy, during the mid to late 1960s, in a red brick house on the corner of Swindon and Light Streets. I began my schooling in the Catholic primary school. It had 2 classrooms, grades 1 to 3 in one and 4 to 7 in another. I was in the former, my older brother and sister were in the latter. School sports and marching practice took place on the tennis court attached to the Convent of Mercy, the home of the nuns who ran the school. By this time our father had been promoted to principal of the Riverton and District High School. It's fair to say that schooling was serious business in our household. I learned to ride on my sister's bike, up and down the shady Light Street. I got my own Melbourne Star for my 10th birthday. Kids rode everywhere then. The family camera came out for birthdays, Christmas and holidays. Some of these took us back to the Flinders or even further afield, but most were caravanning on the coast. So began my lifelong love of the coast and ocean. But that's a story for another day. As I grew older, I was gradually becoming aware of the wider world. News in the late 60s was dominated by 2 major events. I think it's fair to say they jolted Australia out of its post-World War II slumber and probably shaped my outlook on adventure and politics for the rest of my life.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
My brother and I were transfixed by the Apollo space program, collecting mini models of the Apollo command and service modules and the famous LEM, the landing module named Eagle.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Like most Australian children, I watched the Apollo 11 moon landing while sitting on the floor at school in front of a black and white telly that the nuns wheeled out on a trolley. It really was gripping stuff.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The second major story was Australia's involvement in the war in Vietnam. Images broadcast from that conflict are still burned into my consciousness. I've always wondered if my parents sat around our Laminex kitchen table after we kids had gone to bed and talked about the possibility of my older brother being conscripted via the birthday ballot. He would have become eligible in 1974, and conscription continued until 1972, when it was finally abolished by the new Whitlam Labor government. With thick cumulus clouds building and the southwesterly wind strengthening, Dave and I rode out of Riverton following the old main road. We crossed the Gilbert River and travelled west. Then we turned onto Rowlands Road. The gravel path rose and fell in a series of shallow curves as it contoured the edge of the light range. I loved how it was shaped to fit the rolling countryside. The low range was named for Colonel William Light, the first Surveyor General of South Australia, famous for planning the colony's capital Adelaide with its distinctive parklands. Light's vision. We paused on the ride as the sun broke through and lit the way south. The old Bethel Lutheran Church stood in the distance, another testament to the ways in which German migrants shaped the landscape. It wasn't long until we found ourselves pedalling into the Barossa Valley. Colonel Light had named the area after a battle in which he fought against the French while serving in the British Army in 1811, the Battle of Barossa. My parents met after both being sent to teach in the local Nuriupta Secondary School by the Education Department. The name Nuriupta is derived from local indigenous language, meaning neck country. It's said that a giant ancestral spirit called Waino lies here. Learning the origins of place names in Australia tells so much about the interwoven histories of peoples and land. After my parents married, they lived in a small cottage in Hatch Street. As a married woman, my mother had to resign from her position as art teacher. The marriage bar was a policy supported by the Menzies-led federal government of the day, and it denied women the opportunity to continue employment once they married. Menzies' cabinet believed that men were the breadwinners and that a married woman's role was to maintain the home and raise a family. It's hard to believe now that such a policy persisted until 1966 in Australia. Strange thinking back, it probably affected my childhood as well. Being the youngest, I had a few years alone with my mother when my older siblings started school. Occasionally, she would take me out into the countryside. I would squirm around on a blanket while she painted. My brother and sister were born in those years, sheep and wheat making the way for vines in the Barossa. Amongst the old family slide collection, I found an image of new rows of vines, taken from almost the exact same location that Dave and I paused on the trail. We began the next day dodging busy traffic. It felt like we had reached the edges of suburbia. We had left our vehicles with Dave's relatives in Port Adelaide, and he plotted a course along a range of bike paths to get us there. With heavy rain and strong headwinds forecast, we put our heads down and pedalled for home. The Adelaide Hills section of the Mawson Trail would have to wait for another day. We linked some trails up to reach the Stuart O'Grady Bikeway, named after an Australian Olympic and professional cyclist.
The Stuart O'Grady bike path. Aesthetically positioned alongside the main North Road out of Adelaide.
Yeah, nice riding. Light breeze, we're slightly into it, but nice and flat. And no cars on this bit.
Before long, the wide open spaces of the north were replaced by the usual features of the city landscape. With a bit of work, even these can be viewed aesthetically, I guess. We rode through an industrial wetland where the ibis didn't seem to care about the nearby traffic. At one point, we pulled up where a seat had been strategically placed to view an old river redgum. Both the wetland and contemplation tree are needed in a cityscape, I guess, to provide places of refuge and respite. Part of me was happy to be nearing the end of the ride. Another part wanted to stay out on the trail. I was chasing Dave south when we skirted a long curving concrete flyover and then passed beneath the expressway. I felt like I'd passed back through a portal. Through ranges sad and beautiful. Funny how memory works, travelling back along country paths, returning to small inland towns when you least expect it, placing hands on old stone walls, feeling the sunshine on the flesh of childhood, scenting the spring glow of youth along the dry creek. Every now and then, I still catch myself humming along with the breeze through the trees, and I don't know why. It's easy to think that life was better then, in the wide open spaces of yesterday. It's only going back, wandering through that landscape once again, that I can begin to tell which memories are real. Perhaps that's why I rode south, following the Wattchow track to Wilpena. Always thirsty it seemed and low on water in that country. Great Cambrian upthrust of stone overhead. A complex metamorphosed fold of rock, formed and faulted along the edges of a long-vanished ocean. A place where fingers bend, perhaps, the hand forever cupped in stone, drinking from the waterhole. Explorers passed here, of course. Camels, clanking with instruments, led slowly up the valleys, biting and kicking. Chase, now there's a name, should have been a traveller, not a settler. But he brought his sheep to Wilpena, Aqaba, Aruna. Sharp prints in the gritty sands of the dry creek beds. Surveyors, settlers, walkers, all quickly scribbled their names on paper. The parchment now old and yellow, ink faded by the sun. "Keep it safe in the museum," someone said. "Keep it dry in the library." But it was three men at Ikara, the meeting place, talking quietly in the old language, who gave us water. "Take it, that's what it's for," they said. So we did, and rode on south, into ranges sad and beautiful. She lay me wriggling on a blanket placed on shaly ground, left me to play while setting up her easel that quiet Monday morning. Everyone else had gone back to work or school when she drove the old Holden into the hills. I probably looked up and was dazzled by sunburst through the leaves as she penciled in the ridgeline and arranged the horizons. I might have rolled over and stared at an ant trail across the creek stones. Flesh pink, they felt smooth to tiny infant fingers. They tasted dusty and dry when she applied a blue wash across the sky. Then she swiped a splash of red with a sable hairbrush upon the summit of the peak. It's impossible to know where the love of landscape comes from. I can't say anything for sure these days, but in the senses of a child, yielding and careless, there might be a true beginning, out there, in ranges sad and beautiful. We rode on south across the ranges' rolling flanks, following old trade routes from waterhole to waterhole, turning our pedals over where others had travelled before us. Some walked, some rode horses, and some pushed their bicycles north over the hills with a swag and a story to keep them going, looking for copper in the ground, fire in the stone, hoping to find plenty of room for a sheep or two. I guess they're forgotten histories now, written only in the ruins, still shaping the land in inexplicable ways. Someone camped here amongst the gums, by the little pool of water in the creek where we pitched our tents. They boiled their billy where we boil ours. Industry followed, of course, iron rails and concrete, ending the silence of the north, echoes falling quiet in the stony canyons. Towns grew and schools opened. Teachers came to make the kids read Shakespeare, Dickens, Kipling, but also Lawson and McKellar. And how the kids laughed at Mulga Bill's bicycle, because everyone knew someone who had pranged in a creek somewhere. Slowly, they came to love reading about the sunburnt country. In the little town in the valley, that's when we rode south, through ranges sad and beautiful. Blue hills on the radio and a pot of tea. Kids banished to the backyard. But we snuck back in when television came to sit and watch the test pattern, waiting for the kids' shows before the news. There was only one channel anyway. The old kerosene heater keeping us warm. We were already riding our bikes around town when they sent the rockets up from Woomera, exploding like fireworks in the night sky. My brother and I raced each other home thinking it was the end, then dreamt of moon missions and landings. I was too big now for the three-wheeler, so I learned to ride my sister's bike. I could just reach the pedals, rocking my weight from side to side, then rolling along, the wheels clicking under the shady trees on Light Street. There was no traffic then. If a car did turn into your street, they slowed and waved, or asked after your mother and father. Did I notice the light flooding along the range? Did I see the road out of town winding south, leaving Riverton, across the Gilbert River to Kapunda and Nuriupta? One day during the war, we all drove south, further south, through ranges sad and beautiful. School bag on the carrier, swooping through the hills, legs strengthening every year. Other kids had dragsters, but we rode real bikes, Super Elliots and Malvern Stars with the handlebars turned down. Taking the corner out of Waite Street too fast, I rode into the back of a parked car, buckled the front wheel, hoped no one was watching the idiot with the bloody chin lying on the road. Climbing back on, got to school before the bell. A friend asked if I'd cut myself shaving. Another day, reading about the storming of the Bastille, plotting sines and cosines, seeing what the rocks could tell us in the geology lab. "We've got a field trip to the Flinders Ranges," said Mr. Ingram. Paddy Radford and I found a red ring, size of a 10-cent piece, stained into fractured stone. "That's pound quartzite," the teacher said. "Interesting." We sent it to the museum to find out what it was. I had my driver's licence by the time we found out, and the old bike started to gather dust in the shed. Childhood reached its end, in the bright house with the big windows built for an artist, looking out into the hills. It would be years and years before landscape and an old box of Kodachromes brought me back, to ride carefully, watching and listening, along the road that winds its way through ranges sad and beautiful. The ride had reached its end. Not the end, but an end, for now. I felt I had discovered something, in the mix of old and new. New photographs to add to the old Kodachromes. A few poems to add to the family story. A new way of travelling through an old landscape. Wheels spinning and lungs bursting on the climbs. Wind roaring and country flashing by on the descents. Each day I'd taken a few precious moments to write and think about how the places and experiences of childhood impact upon the rest of a lifetime. I finished with a feeling for a landscape peopled with my own family and its history, and a lingering sense of memories saved on the edge of vanishing.